Strategy games and weird ports are two things you wouldn't expect to go together, but apparently have a long and loving relationship that goes way back. Not typically a genre that I cover all that often, because let's face it, most of them aren't the most exciting games ever made. I've been amassing a growing list of them that is becoming near impossible to ignore. So many ports with great potential to be covered, like StarCraft on Nintendo 64, or SimCity on the Game Boy Advance. Though, I really wouldn't mind not doing that one. You guys can consider this video a sort of trial run to see if I can talk about these types of games in a way that isn't the most boring thing ever. And hey, if you like it, maybe we'll get to cover some more in the future. Basically, to cut a long introduction short, I want to talk about Civilization. Welcome to Port Patrol, the show where I look at weird, interesting, or knockoff ports of video games, and today we're taking a look at Sid Meier's Civilization for the Super Nintendo. For those who don't know much about Civilization, I'll give a very brief rundown before we jump into the actual port. Civilization was a 1991 DOS game by Microprose, in which you take a fledgling group of settlers in the year 4000 BC, form a civilization with them, expand across the globe, gather resources, and of course, wage war on anyone who was unlucky enough to spawn right next to you. It was quite a complex game, but was still very accessible and easy to understand, which isn't something you can say for a lot of strategy games, let alone ones released in 1991. Look, all I'm saying is you don't get a lot of people nowadays saying, "Gosh, I really feel like booting up a game of medieval lord, soldier, kings of Europe," and I cannot even begin to possibly imagine why that could be. I suppose it was probably inevitable they would try to port the series to as many systems as possible. I mean, sure, we later got Civilization Revolution on the DS, and even Civ 6 has made it to the iPad of all things, but I didn't expect them to do it so quickly with the Super Nintendo version, released in 1994. And without spoiling the next 8 minutes of video or anything, it's actually really good. The game begins and plays just like the original, so you start with a small band of settlers, or two if you're really lucky, found your first city and get to work on building your mighty civilization. Or if you're like me, flounder about doing absolutely nothing for 80 turns because you built your city in a stupid place and end up having to restart the game. Yep, this is definitely a Civ game alright. Honestly, the biggest difference is the fact it no longer makes you want to gouge your eyes out. The original Civ, you know, probably one of the ugliest games I've ever played. If I wanted to be nice, I would say it does its job and nothing more. But my god is it ugly. How is that a desert? In what world does a desert look like that? The Super Nintendo version thankfully received a much needed facelift with completely redone environments, user interfaces, and they even animated the water. Didn't bother animating anything else, but hey, we'll take what we can get. It all comes together to make a very visually pleasing game that in a weird way kinda makes it look more like a tactical RPG like Fire Emblem than a strategy game. I actually think that might have been the kind of vibe they were going for, because the introductory cutscene has been changed from showing the formation of the Earth to a goddess appearing before you and gifting you the ability to form civilizations. It's very old school RPG, and I absolutely adore it. And I mean, just listen to the city screen music. It sounds like it was meant to be a shop theme in Final Fantasy or something. I absolutely love it. Though, like I said before, don't let this game's pretty makeup and suitably Super Nintendo sounding user interface fool you. This is still Civilization 1, and for better or for worse, everything that was in that game has made it over to this one. Apart from the DRM. That didn't, thankfully. Ordering units is relatively painless, although I really wish it had the go-to option like the original did. At first, moving units around isn't too bad, but when it comes to moving lots of them across a At first, moving units isn't too bad, but when it comes to moving lots of them across a big space, it can become very cumbersome. Here, a tribal village who were on the opposite side of the map decided to give me a settler, which I guess was nice of them, but I kinda wish they didn't, to be honest. So I had to move them, space by space, every single turn. And then finally, about 20 minutes later, they reached the borders of my civ, before promptly getting absolutely destroyed by a bandit I didn't see. Yep, this is still definitely a civ game. That said, the game is still noob friendly. There's tutorials if you want them, help boxes that tell you what every tile does, information on all the stats of all the units, information on what every building and wonder does, which only makes it more perplexing why you can only learn what every science discovery does after you discover it. Like, okay, cool, it's all well and good that I can now make absolutely nothing with what I just discovered, but it would have been nice to know that 20 turns ago before I wasted my time. Having a dedicated Civpedia like the PC release would have been very helpful, and while most of the information found in the Civpedia is in this game, it's all segmented and a bit more awkward to find out what you need. But realistically speaking, I highly doubt that nowadays this would be anyone's first Civ game. And no matter which one you've played, you should be able to have at least half decent guesses at what most of this stuff does. And if it is your first Civ game, then I honestly have to ask why. Talking about this game has been way more annoying than I ever thought it would be. It's one of those games where you learn so much about it in one playthrough that by the end of a play session, almost every single point about the game I'd written into my notes was completely invalidated. I found it annoying and cumbersome that the city screen had been split across 3 different menus, making it more difficult to manage your cities, until I found out you can access all 3 screens from one menu with the arrow buttons. But then I found clicking those buttons with the in-game cursor, which is actually pretty cool, I'll explain more on that later, really quite cumbersome, which became an issue when you're deciding what to build and have a massive list of possible choices. Until I found out you can simply hold down one of the shoulder buttons and scroll through them easily. I found having to click on the boundaries of the map screen annoying to scroll, until again I found out you can just hold down the shoulder button and use the D-pad. Honestly, the only genuine annoyances I have with the game were also present in the original. So stuff like the AI being brain dead on the lower difficulties but absolute cheaters on the higher ones, there being no way to easily disband towns, there being no way to upgrade your units, and the process of upgrading all your roads to railroads being the most mind-numbing, tedious, agonising thing imaginable. But when it comes to problems with the port itself, I'm actually very hard-pressed to find much, which is rare. For me at least, I'm honestly quite stumped. I mean, sure, when it comes to actually playing the game, you can't beat a good old keyboard and mouse and the original MS-DOS version. Or can you? Because this game actually supports the Super Nintendo mouse. Could the mouse give this version the edge it needs to beat out the original? No. It's actually really awful. Technically it works fine. You move the mouse and the cursor moves around like a real actual mouse would. But the UI is still obviously meant to be played with the controller, so all you're effectively doing is making it so you're playing the game with 6 less buttons. So you can't easily scroll across the map, you can't examine the terrain, it's just not a good way to play. It's already made to work perfectly with the Super Nintendo controller, especially the cursor, which had a lot of thought put into it. It works just like a regular mouse cursor, so you can move it around the screen, but it does so in staggered intervals. At first it feels awful and choppy, but when you get into the game it makes so much sense. The intervals are the perfect size so you're always aligned to the in-game grid, and are also the perfect size to easily navigate menus. So even though it feels like you're navigating a menu just like any other game would, it still retains its full freedom of movement for actual gameplay, which I think is just a really cool design decision, and I am almost certainly the only person who cares, so I'll shut up about it now. One of my favourite parts of Port Patrol is looking back on reviews of these ports at the time they were released, to see what the general opinion on the game was when it came out. It helps provide perspective on how impressive, or not, the port was at the time, and sometimes you just stumble across something really funny. Like this review from 1999, who hated the game so much they even went as far to say that Sid Meier must be rolling in his grave. It's worth noting that Sid Meier isn't dead. Now you guys know by now that I'm not one who likes to have controversial opinions. Apart from that time, and that one, and that one. God, what was wrong with me? But I honestly kind of, sort of, prefer this version to the original. There's honestly so little between them that a preference is purely subjective. It's a near perfect port, improving upon the original in so many ways. Legitimately, the only things the original game has over this version is the fact you can play it with a keyboard and mouse, and it loads faster. And I guess if you want to get really nitpicky, there are a few subtle changes between the two, but in terms of graphics, and music, and pretty much everything else, I absolutely love the care and attention that was put into this game, and cannot recommend it enough to any fans of Civilization out there who want to give it a go. It still has the same addicting, just one more turn gameplay that meant that I recorded way too much footage for this video, which is unfortunate because then I ended up catching a cold. God damn it.